The coded intercepts arriving at the Imperial Navy Ministry carry the death warrant of an empire. German High Command has formally signed an unconditional surrender at Reims. The European war is over, and the terrifying promise of the Allied war machine is now violently clear. Japan is fighting the entire industrialized world completely alone. The news hits the Japanese capital like a physical shockwave. Surviving diaries from foreign ministry officials record the mood as one of profound, paralyzing dread. They realized instantly that the diplomatic shield of the Axis alliance had evaporated overnight, leaving them entirely exposed. Inside the Prime Minister's official residence, 77-year-old Kantaro Suzuki absorbs the catastrophic briefing. A retired admiral who still carries an assassin's bullet inside his body from a pre-war military coup, Suzuki understands the grim arithmetic of global conflict. He was appointed just weeks earlier with a tacit, heavily veiled mandate from the emperor to find a way out of the war. But the official government doctrine strictly forbids the word surrender. Publicly, the military propaganda machine roars to life. National radio broadcasts declare that Germany's collapse merely purifies the global struggle, wiping away a weak ally and leaving Japan to achieve a glorious, solitary victory. Behind closed doors, a quiet, suffocating panic grips the Supreme War Direction Council, known as the Big Six. The strategic reality is unavoidable and mathematically lethal. For 3 years, the United States had divided its colossal industrial output, sending millions of men, thousands of heavy bombers, and millions of tons of steel to crush Europe. Now, that massive pipeline of destruction is pivoting sharply toward the Pacific theater. British carrier fleets are already steaming eastward to join the American Armada. The entire arsenal of democracy is locking onto a single target, and the Japanese leadership knows they cannot match it. How long could the home islands hold out? Post-war interrogations of Japanese logistics officers reveal a fatalistic consensus. The economic war was already completely lost. By May, the relentless American submarine blockade had effectively severed the shipping lanes from the conquered territories in the South Pacific. Domestic factories are starving for iron and bauxite. Aviation fuel is so critically scarce that vital training flights are permanently grounded. Mechanics are desperately attempting to distill aircraft fuel from pulverized pine roots. The men sitting around the cabinet table know this brutal truth. They know the Imperial fleet is effectively destroyed. Yet, the paralysis of command dictates their next move: to suggest peace on Allied terms, meaning the total disarmament of the military and the occupation of the sacred homeland, is an immediate death sentence. Hardline factions within the Imperial Japanese Army, led by War Minister Korechika Anami, actively monitor the peace advocates. Anami firmly demands that the nation mobilize for a decisive, apocalyptic battle on the beaches of Kyushu. The leadership is trapped not just by the encroaching enemy, but by the radicalized military culture they cultivated. The only politically survivable strategy is to inflict such catastrophic casualties on the invading Americans that Washington will be forced to negotiate a conditional peace. To achieve this, the Japanese High Command urgently requires time, and time is currently being bought with rivers of blood 350 miles south of the home islands. On the scarred, burning ridges of Okinawa, over 100,000 Japanese troops are fighting a doomed, subterranean war of attrition. The garrison is systematically collapsing under relentless naval gunfire and flamethrowers, but their orders are simply to bleed the Americans for as long as possible. Okinawa is the final barrier. Once the island inevitably falls, the Allies will possess the massive staging ground needed to launch the largest amphibious invasion in human history directly onto Japanese soil. Suzuki and his fractured cabinet recognize the ticking clock. The pressure inside the council chamber is crushing. If they cannot stop the American invasion militarily, they must find a political miracle to split the Allied coalition before the homeland is completely turned to ash. As the B-29s darken the skies over Tokyo, the desperate statesmen look toward the one major world power that has not yet declared war against them. The military collapse of Okinawa sends a paralyzing shockwave through the Supreme War Direction Council. The American blockade is tightening, and the men running the Japanese empire are rapidly running out of both time and terrain. Prime Minister Suzuki's cabinet is deeply fractured, trapped in a deadly, suffocating stalemate over how to survive a war they all privately acknowledge is mathematically lost. With the Axis alliance permanently shattered and the German military dismantled, the Council attempts a desperate, highly implausible geopolitical pivot to save themselves. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, a 62-year-old veteran diplomat with a reputation for sharp realism, steps into the void with a highly classified diplomatic gamble. He understands the raw industrial math better than the generals. He knows that Japan cannot survive the undivided, focused wrath of the Allied forces. Togo's strategy is to secure immediate mediation through the Soviet Union. Japan and the USSR still maintain a neutrality pact, and Togo convinces a desperate council that Joseph Stalin might be persuaded to broker a negotiated peace with Washington and London in exchange for massive territorial concessions in mainland Asia. It is an illusion built entirely on blind desperation. Post-war records of the Japanese Foreign Ministry reveal the agonizing self-deception of this plan. Togo himself later wrote that relying on the Soviets was a terribly fragile, dangerous hope, but it was the absolute only alternative he saw to total national annihilation. He immediately orders his ambassador in Moscow, Naoto Sato, to formally approach the Kremlin and beg for an audience with Soviet leadership. But inside the War Ministry, a very different, far bloodier strategy is already in aggressive motion. War Minister Korechika Anami fiercely rejects any diplomatic path that involves unconditional surrender, military disarmament, or foreign occupation. Instead, Anami accelerates Ketsugo, or Operation Decisive. This is a sprawling, fanatical defense plan designed to turn the home islands into a massive, heavily fortified kill zone. The strategy does not aim for military victory. The explicit goal is to bleed the invading American forces so severely on the southern beaches of Kyushu that Washington will suffer a total collapse in political will and offer a conditional truce. Can human waves stop mechanized fleets? The Imperial Army intelligence officers know the terrifying reality. To execute Ketsugo, Anami orders the rapid mobilization of 2.3 million regular troops, backed by a newly conscripted civilian militia of 28 million men, women, and teenagers. However, the internal logistics reports are completely catastrophic. Millions of these civilian defenders are issued nothing but antique muskets, farming tools, and sharpened bamboo spears to fight against American heavy armored divisions. The Big Six Council is completely paralyzed by these competing delusions. They spend the critical, shrinking weeks of early summer deadlock between Togo's unanswered diplomatic lifeline and Anami's preparation for national suicide. The strict codes of military honor and the constant, documented threat of assassination by radicalized junior army officers prevent anyone from openly admitting that both plans are completely doomed. While the Council desperately waits for a response from Moscow, the Americans are already reading their mail. Allied intelligence officers, utilizing the highly classified MAGIC code-breaking program, routinely intercept and decrypt the frantic cables between Tokyo and Moscow. The decoded intercepts show Ambassador Sato bluntly warning Togo in a recorded dispatch that the Soviet Union is actively massing mechanized troops on the Manchurian border and has zero interest in saving the Japanese Empire. The warning is systematically ignored by a leadership that simply cannot accept the reality of their total isolation. By stubbornly clinging to the hope of Soviet intervention, the Japanese high command squanders the final window of opportunity they possess to negotiate a surrender. The political stalling tactics buy them nothing but further destruction. While the politicians argue over diplomatic phrasing and the generals drill children with bamboo spears, a massive, highly synchronized logistical operation is quietly shifting the balance of global power. The European theater is officially closed, and the victors are redeploying their deadliest assets. Thousands of seasoned American combat troops and heavy bomber squadrons are already packing their staging camps in Germany, receiving classified transfer orders that will send them directly to the Marianas. The phantom diplomatic lifeline to Moscow remains unanswered, but the brutal, physical reality of fighting a one-front global war is already incinerating the home islands. Without the distraction of the European theater, the United States Army Air Forces unleash an ocean of steel and fire upon Japanese cities. General Curtis LeMay's XXI Bomber Command rapidly scales up its operations, sending armadas of up to 500 B-29 superfortresses at a time to systematically erase Japan's industrial centers. The emotional weight of Germany's surrender takes physical form in the sky. Japanese air defense units, exhausted, chronically outgunned, and lacking radar-guided artillery, watch helplessly as the low-altitude firebombing campaign expands outward from Tokyo to consume Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. The night sky literally glows with the destruction of the nation's infrastructure. On the ground, Imperial Japanese Navy intelligence officers frantically track the relentless buildup of Allied shipping, watching the blueprints of their own demise chart across the map. They identify a vast, terrifying logistics network stretching from the American West Coast Strait to the newly conquered, blood-soaked airstrips of Okinawa. Simultaneously, the American submarine blockade, designated Operation Starvation, flawlessly chokes off the home islands. Surviving post-war records from the Transport Ministry show that by June 1945, thousands of American aerial mines dropped into the narrow Shimonoseki Strait, effectively trapped the remnants of the Japanese merchant fleet. Raw materials stop arriving entirely. The shipping lanes are permanently severed, leaving the island nation quarantined and bleeding. Can the empire even build weapons? The internal math proves they cannot. Behind closed doors, the Cabinet Planning Board delivers a highly classified, devastating logistics report directly to the Supreme Command. The document projects the total, catastrophic depletion of Japan's aviation fuel and steel reserves by late summer. The nation is officially running on fumes. Aircraft factories are reduced to assembling rudimentary suicide planes using scavenged scrap metal, canvas, and wood. The report explicitly warns that without imported bauxite for aluminum and coking coal for blast furnaces, the entire munitions industry will grind to a complete halt within 90 days, stripping the army of its ability to fight. It is a mathematical death sentence that cannot be outmaneuvered. Despite possessing this undeniable hard data, the military high command violently rejects the concept of surrender. The Big Six, War Council, refuses to look at the numbers, choosing instead to double down on an agonizingly fatalistic defense strategy. If the factories cannot produce tanks and artillery shells, the generals will rely on human flesh. War Minister Anime and the Army hardliners aggressively push the volunteer draft law through a heavily monitored, terrified parliament. The desperate decree mandates the immediate conscription of all civilian men up to age 60 and unmarried women up to age 40 into combat roles. This untrained civilian militia is ordered to defend the invasion beaches against the most heavily mechanized amphibious force in human history. Post-war interrogations of surviving regional commanders highlight the sheer mental absurdity of the High Command's orders. Veteran instructors are dispatched to local schools to train teenage girls and elderly men in the martial art of wielding sharpened bamboo spears. The official military defense manuals instruct these starving civilians to rush forward and strike at the abdomens of American paratroopers as they land. It is a strategy completely divorced from military reality, driven purely by a samurai honor code that demands national extermination over a humiliating, unconditional defeat. The leadership's stubborn refusal to accept the logistical collapse ensures the daily slaughter continues unchecked. The military machine is running entirely on inertia, blind obedience, and the blood of its citizens. Even as entire city blocks are reduced to ash overnight and the civilian food rations drop drastically below starvation levels, the Supreme Command locks itself into a rigid posture of defiance. But ignoring the relentless arithmetic of war does not stop the clock. Across the globe, the victorious Allied leaders are packing their briefcases and boarding heavy cruisers, preparing to meet in a bombed-out Berlin suburb to finalize the absolute destruction of the Japanese state. The civilian defense manuals are entirely useless as the nightly infernos continue to consume tens of thousands of wooden homes across the home islands. Deep inside the Imperial Palace grounds, safely sealed within an underground, damp concrete bunker, the six most powerful men in the Japanese Empire sit in agonizing, self-imposed silence. The Supreme War Direction Council is functionally paralyzed. They possess the absolute, unquestioned authority to halt the daily slaughter of their own citizens, yet they are completely immobilized by a terrifying internal threat. To openly speak the word surrender in this subterranean chamber is to invite a violent military coup. Why ignore the incoming intelligence? The answer is domestic physical survival. The senior politicians and admirals are acutely aware that radicalized junior army officers are actively monitoring their movements, ready to assassinate any leader who dares to suggest capitulation. This pervasive climate of terror ensures that the highest echelons of government run purely on a toxic mixture of inertia, blind protocol, and fear. Even as intercepted American radio traffic and daily battlefield reports confirm the total eradication of their final defensive perimeters across the Pacific, the High Command refuses to flinch. The fatal strategic error is undeniable. To ensure their own immediate political survival, the leadership guarantees the physical destruction of the nation. The central, immovable obstacle to peace is War Minister Korechika Anime. A fierce, uncompromising traditionalist, Anime effectively holds absolute veto power over the entire Japanese government. He violently rejects any back-channel peace terms that would require the Imperial Army to disarm itself, or worse, allow a single foreign boot to step onto the sacred home islands. Surviving transcripts of the council debates show Anime stubbornly demanding four impossible conditions for peace, including the absurd right of the Japanese military to conduct its own war crimes trials. Could they stop the slaughter? They possessed the authority, but entirely lacked the political courage to defy the army hardliners. This critical failure of leadership permanently squanders the final, agonizing months the cabinet had to negotiate a diplomatic exit before the invasion. The human cost of their paralysis is mathematically staggering. During the crucial, completely wasted weeks of June and July, American B-29s drop an additional 40,000 tons of incendiaries on unprotected urban centers. Post-war casualty reports indicate that hundreds of thousands of civilians burned to death or are left entirely homeless, while the Big Six endlessly debate the exact definition of national honor. The sheer scale of the disconnect between the underground command bunker and the burning skies above is absolute. Intelligence officers attached to the foreign ministry circulate highly classified, translated summaries of global radio broadcasts, desperately trying to force the council to accept the reality of their complete isolation. These summaries definitively prove that the Allied powers are not fracturing, but actively consolidating their massive military strength. Prime Minister Suzuki's diplomatic fantasy of Soviet intervention remains a hollow, unanswered delusion, yet the deeply divided council stubbornly clings to it rather than face the humiliation of American terms. By choosing to let the war machine coast on the fading fumes of fanaticism, the leadership forces the conflict past the point of no return. Every day, the council delays making a definitive decision. The physical military infrastructure continues to evaporate. Imperial Navy staff officers formally report that the last remaining operational battleships are permanently immobilized in the harbor at Coup, entirely lacking the heavy bunker fuel required to even turn their engines. The once mighty home fleet is reduced to nothing more than a collection of stationary, floating anti-aircraft batteries waiting to be systematically sunk from the air. Yet, the stubborn, deadly silence in Tokyo only accelerates the massive international machinery moving against them. The narrow window for a negotiated, back-channel settlement is rapidly slamming shut. While the Japanese generals fiercely debate how many millions of civilians they are willing to sacrifice on the beaches of Kyushu, the unified leaders of the Allied powers are gathering halfway across the world. A massive, heavily guarded diplomatic convoy is moving into a bombed-out suburb of Berlin. The mid-July summit at Potsdam is looming, where the victorious, undivided Allied coalition will issue their final, uncompromising ultimatum for Japan's absolute and total destruction. The uncompromising demands issued from the bombed-out Berlin suburb are met with a fatal, dismissive silence in Tokyo. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, still desperately clinging to the illusion of a diplomatic back-channel through Moscow, publicly declares a policy of mokusatsu, to kill with silence. This catastrophic political gamble seals the destiny of the Japanese Empire. By choosing to officially ignore the final Allied warning, The Supreme War Direction Council effectively guarantees that the full, unmitigated violence of a one-front global war will be unleashed upon their soil. The highest leaders deliberately choose inertia, and the devastating bill for their inaction finally comes due. The physical consequence of 3 months of isolated defiance arrives directly from the sky. On August 6th, a single American B-29 bomber drops a uranium weapon over Hiroshima, instantly erasing the city center and incinerating tens of thousands of lives in a fraction of a second. Yet, the paralysis of command inside the Imperial bunker remains absolutely unbreakable. Even as horrifying, unprecedented reports of mass radiation poisoning and flash burns filter into the War Ministry. War Minister Korechika Anami stubbornly refuses to concede defeat. He coldly argues to the cabinet that the Americans could not possibly possess more than one of these devices, insisting that the military must continue to prepare the civilian population for a bloody, hand-to-hand beach defense. What shatters their delusion? The total, violent collapse of their diplomatic phantom. Before dawn on August 9th, the Japanese High Command receives a catastrophic intelligence flash that paralyzes the underground room. Over 1.5 million Soviet mechanized troops, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, have suddenly poured across a sprawling, 2,000-mile front into Manchuria. They systematically obliterate the depleted, under-equipped Japanese Guandong army in a matter of hours. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo's desperate, fragile hope of Joseph Stalin acting as a neutral peacemaker instantly disintegrates into a massive, unstoppable two-front slaughter. The mathematical reality they stubbornly ignored in May has finally cornered them in August. Just hours after the devastating news of the Soviet invasion reaches Tokyo, a second atomic bomb detonates over the industrial port of Nagasaki. The twin pillars of Japan's survival strategy, a massive, casualty-inflicting defense of the home islands, and a negotiated, back-channel peace through Moscow, are simultaneously annihilated in a single morning. The Big Six War Council is forced into an emergency imperial conference deep inside the suffocatingly hot, poorly ventilated palace air raid shelter. The political deadlock that paralyzed the government for 3 long months is finally shattered not by the generals, but by an unprecedented, direct intervention from Emperor Hirohito himself. The military hardliners weep openly, but they are powerless to countermand the voice of their living God. The emperor explicitly commands the fractured, exhausted government to bear the unbearable and accept the unconditional terms of the Potsdam Declaration. The military leadership had fatally misunderstood the grim, unforgiving arithmetic of a modern global war. They genuinely believed that spiritual fanaticism and a willingness to commit national suicide could outlast the overwhelming industrial supremacy and unified political resolve of the Allied coalition. By deliberately stalling for better diplomatic terms when they knew the conflict was militarily lost after Germany's surrender, the cabinet needlessly squandered the lives of hundreds of thousands of their own citizens. Rather than face the humiliation of disarmament, War Minister Anami returns to his residence and commits ritual suicide. The tragedy of the Japanese High Command in the summer of 1945 was their absolute, paralyzing refusal to accept a terrifying truth. The moment Berlin fell, their empire was already dead. They fought the entire world alone simply to protect their own rigid military honor, paying for their political pride with the radioactive ashes of their own cities. The post-war interrogation logs of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey capture this fatal arrogance perfectly. When American investigators later asked a senior Japanese naval staff officer why the Supreme Command continued fighting long after their fuel and raw materials were gone, he bluntly confessed, "We could not find a way to stop the momentum of our own propaganda."